the topic tonight is on romanticizing illegality. And we read two pieces. The first one was by Trotsky from 1913. It's called Why Marxists Oppose Individual Terrorism. And the first thing I want to point out is to note the word individual. It's the noun. It's not the noun, but the adjective that Marxists object to. White terror, no good. Individual terror, no good. Red terror, not so bad, right? And the same goes for insurrection and lots of other things. The same goes for insurrection in terms of like mass, like we want to see one big mass insurrection that brings down the state. So this piece, Trotsky's piece, was a Marxist response to the Narodniks, many of whose basic ideas continue to predominate 150 years later. The Narodniks were sort of anarchist peasants, intellectuals in Russia. And few advocate for actual terrorism nowadays, but these ideas apply to lesser illegal tactics, to like vandalism, sabotage, etc. So first thing to make clear is that Trotsky makes clear is that there's no objection on moral grounds to any tactic that advances class struggle. And he points out the bourgeois hypocrisy around this. He says the bourgeois state and its laws are nothing but an apparatus for capitalist terror, for white terror. And he also says, pay no mind to the bought and paid for moralists who, in response to any terrorist act, make solemn declarations about the absolute value of human life. And elsewhere, he talks about how empty that is when our class remains dominated by the investing class. He calls terrorism substitutionist, individualist, and elitist. It substitutes the heroic, in quotes, activities of a small group for the coordinated activity of the class. There's no need to have the organized masses behind you if this is your tactic. And I should say that the Narodniks were assassinating czars and police officers and bombing places and so that's what he's saying, like those quote unquote heroic activities. So he says, contrary to the anarchists and in direct struggle against them, socialists reject attempts to artificially force the development of society and to substitute chemical preparations for the insufficient revolutionary strength of the proletariat. And he also highlights that we have different goals. Marxists believe in working class self-emancipation, socialism from below. Anarchists reject the working class, or many do, as the agent of change, favoring the enlightened few instead. For instance, going back to just the 60s, the Weather Underground believed that white workers were incapable of radicalization and were part of the problem. So that strategically orients them in a very different direction. And wanted to bring up that there's a great anecdote in Tariq Ali's biography of Lenin called The Dilemmas of Lenin, where he requested a meeting with Kropotkin in 1919 after the Bolsheviks won. And he explained the decisive factor that helped him solve the dilemma between anarchism and socialism. He said it was the necessity of mass struggle, only with the masses, through the masses. All other methods, including those of the anarchists, have been relegated to the limbo of history. They only demoralize people who, in one way or another, have been drawn out on that old, worn-out path. So Trotsky says that terrorism reduces self-activity. That's one of the big problems. It requires organizational forms and methods that are inherently unaccountable to the working class. the tactics require a highly conspiratorial minority to carry out its actions, and therefore they are antagonistic to the development of a mass movement. It betrays the principles of workers' democracy and abandons the task of building class power. It encourages passivity, leads to disillusionment and apathy, reduces interest in self-organization and self-education. And Trotsky contrasts this with the strike. And he says that the strike is the method of struggle that flows directly from workers' strategic position in the production process. And it increases self-confidence. It does the opposite. Whereas terrorism belittles the role of the masses in their own consciousness. It reconciles them to powerlessness and turns their hopes toward a great liberator who will accomplish their mission for them. Another criticism is that it isolates revolutionaries from workers. Trotsky says it makes it easier for the state to drive a wedge between the workers' movement and revolutionaries. But perhaps most damning of all, it's ineffectual. Ineffectual at everything except increasing state repression. The piece talks about murders, explosions, etc., are exciting and striking in outward form, but absolutely harmless as far as the social system goes. The mechanism remains intact and continues to function. So you can become ungovernable without changing a thing. This other quote from another sort of anarchist, Albert Camus, comes to mind. He said, "The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion." And, you know, it's so romantic. It sounds so great, but there's no freedom through our individual behavior and lifestyle. You know, nothing changes. And in this case, Trotsky talks about, or he says that the smoke from the confusion clears away after an act of terrorism. The panic disappears. The successor of the murdered minister makes his appearance. Life settles in again into the old rut. The wheel of capitalist exploitation turns as before. Only the police repression grows more savage and brazen. And one thing I didn't even address in this, wasn't even thinking about, is the use of the word terrorism by the imperialist states. I've just sort of been taking it as face value, whereas, you know, usually when we hear the T word, it's not, you know, it's really ripe with imperialist sentiment. Trotsky says there's nothing wrong with revenge. And he says, we don't want to extinguish the proletariat's unfulfilled feeling of revenge, but on the contrary, to stir it up again and again, and to deepen it, and to direct it against the real causes of all injustice and human baseness. I really love that. But individual revenge, it's the adjective, not the noun, that's the problem, doesn't satisfy us. Quote, "The account we have to settle with the capitalist system is too great. To learn to see all the crimes committed against humanity, all the indignities to which the human body and spirit are subjected as the twisted outgrowths and expressions of the existing social system, in order to direct all our energies into a collective struggle against this system. That is the direction in which the burning desire for revenge can find its highest moral satisfaction." Pretty great, pretty great. All right. So moving on to the Lukács piece that we read. It's called Legality and Illegality. It's from 1920. And again, Lukács is not as straightforward as he could be. Really upsets me. I had to read this a lot, and I may still get some of the stuff wrong, but he said, we must slough off both the cretinism of legality and the romanticism of illegality. So right there, he's talking about the reformists and ultra-leftists or anarchists, or, and he talks about reformists fetishize the ballot box, in short, and they regard the state as an institution standing above the classes that struggle to gain control of it. By viewing the state as an object of struggle rather than as the enemy, they have already lost. So we see this a lot, and we combat this a lot, like the view that the state is this neutral entity. So that's the reformists. The ultra-leftists, on the other hand, more like the topic of tonight's conversation, really, fetishize illegality. And both poles, both extremes reveal an infatuation with the law, a fixation on the superstructure, I would say. And this is one of the main points of Lukács here. But another side note from that Tariq Ali book, Lenin called terrorists liberals with bombs. Both were focused on a mere change in leadership at the top, one through legal electoral work and the other through assassination. Marxists must break with both, whether or not to engage. And for Lukács, he says, like, the key is to really kill the cop in our heads, and to treat the question of legality versus illegality as a purely tactical question. He says the risk of breaking the law should not be regarded any differently than the risk of missing a train connection when on an important journey. I love that. He says that romanticizing illegality is an infantile disorder of the communist movement. Using Lenin's word, that it underestimates the strength of the system. And we see these kind of delusions of grandeur all the time. In fact, I was on Instagram today, and this anti-civilizationist anarchist, like what do they call it? A primitivist, was saying that the Denver communists couldn't be considered radical because we show our faces online. I don't know what they think what they're doing that's so useful, that's worth hiding under a rock for, but whatever. But the romanticism, so Lukács also says that the romanticizing illegality also confers upon illegal action a special aura, a revolutionary authenticity that inadvertently reinforces the legitimacy of the state and preserves the authority of the law in inverted form. So that this is that main point of his. And he cites the Socialist Revolutionaries. So this was written in 1920. I guess the SRs were still around. He talks about the Socialist Revolutionaries whose commitment to illegality exposed their ideological attachment to bourgeois concepts of law, which is interesting, He says that the question, so getting back to the main question, he says that the question of legal versus illegal struggle leads us inevitably to the general problem of organized power, to the problem of law and the state, and ultimately to the problem of ideology. And then he talks about how the law merely enshrines what already is, the domination of capital. So the law just sanctifies the existence of the conditions that are favorable to the ruling class. And the way he says this is, quote, "The organs of authority harmonize to such an extent with the economic laws governing men's lives, or seem so overwhelmingly superior that men experience them as natural forces." So this is like legitimizing the system, basically. The capitalist system depends on force and ideas, but force is never enough. Ideas are more important. to grant legitimacy. And it is these ideas that Marxism must challenge. Lukács says that Marxist theory is designed to put the proletariat into a very particular frame of mind. The capitalist state must appear as a historical product, not eternal or inevitable or legitimate ultimately. Whereas currently, the dominant view is that the state, laws, and economy of the bourgeoisie, creations of the bourgeoisie, tools of the bourgeoisie, are seen as the only possible environment that we can exist in. And Lukács, through experience in Hungary and witnessing the proletarian victory in Russia, says, even in victory, the proletariat is forced to take power while it inwardly still acknowledges the bourgeois social order as the only authentic and legal one. So up to the point of victory, these doubts and misconceptions persist. So yeah, he concludes by saying, only that we have to dispense with the two extremes and treat legal versus illegal methods strictly as a tactical decision. And then he talks about how the simultaneous and alternating use of legal and illegal methods encourages a revolutionary attitude toward the state via its exposure as a brutal instrument of capitalist oppression. All right, so that's basically like the two pieces, and then I want to talk a little bit more about some personal observations and experiences and that kind of thing. One, I wanted to talk a little bit about the anarchist concept of the propaganda of the deed. The basic idea is that heroic action, extreme action, militant action by a select few is going to activate the masses and wake them up from their slumber, stimulate their participation in struggle. It's born out of a kind of revolutionary impatience. Trotsky talks about that in that piece. And it stems from a combination of flawed ideas. One, that the ruling class and its state can be forced to grant reforms through the bold actions of a small minority. Two, that violence is necessary to wake up the sleepwalking masses and get them involved. And three, that repression exposes the state's violent character and promotes the need to abolish it. The propaganda of the deed is a little different from complete substitutionism. There have been like socialists in the past who have been more complete substitutionists. Just a small conspiratorial minority not so much in the past really, can accomplish the type of revolution that we want. Whereas advocates of the propaganda of the deed generally accept the need for the masses to step forward. So they're not denying that part. But a Marxist read on this, I would say, is that the development of revolutionary consciousness is shaped by exploitation and oppression, but it's also shaped by participation in struggle. That can be really decisive. So the goal of struggle must be to broaden and deepen the radicalization and mobilization to get more people involved. How an action is perceived by the class is a critical question that we should always have on our minds. Specifically, the section of the class we're trying to relate to, those who might be convinced to support and be drawn into action. We are in a battle for those hearts and minds. Perception changes based on the context and level of struggle. For instance, the burning of the Minneapolis police station in the context of Black people rising up over George Floyd's murder received massive popular support. The breaking of some Quiznos windows some months later did not. So let's see. some things that secrecy and illegality and clandestine, and in fact, an over infatuation with clandestine activity can do. It can undercut popular support, which typically it was never sought in the first place by ultra leftists. It can justify state repression and open the door to provocateurs. We've been criticized for sharing protest photos, just innocent protest photos, and even flyers. I take this as a demonstration that our critics have a completely different orientation to struggle. A protest is a demand to be seen and heard. And rather than trying to demystify and invite people into protest, many anarchists would prefer to keep it relegated to their whisper networks. And one thing that goes along with this is this phrase, diversity of tactics, which comes out of Occupy, I guess. And it basically means anything goes, and that there's no responsibility to the group. There's no need to make an effort to collectively decide on tactics. And it's also used to suppress criticism of inappropriate tactics. I want to stress that we care nothing for the law. We care as little as the other class conscious, pieces on the board care for it. The capitalist class is always quite willing to drop any pretense of illegality or of legality. But at the same time, our legal rights are the most valuable political acquisitions from past struggle. Socialists must staunchly uphold these indispensable instruments of workers' struggle for emancipation against any encroachment. We actually operate under conditions of great political freedom in our current context, far more than basically anyone that we study. And it's our duty to use the tools that our class fought for to advance struggle as best we can. Let's see, I want to take one more side trip into history on the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution. And in 1905, after the revolution, Lenin instructed the Bolsheviks that he said squads must begin at once military training. Must at once begin military training by launching operations immediately. Some may undertake to kill a spy or blow up a police station. Others to raid a bank, to confiscate funds for the insurrection. Others may drill or prepare plans of localities, etc. But the essential thing is to begin at once to learn from actual practice, to have no fear of these trial attacks. They may, of course, degenerate into extremes, but that is an evil of the morrow, whereas the evil today is our inertness, our doctrinaire spirit, our learned immobility, and our senile fear of initiative. Let every group learn, if it is only by beating up policemen, a score or so victims will be more than compensated for by the fact that this will train hundreds of experienced fighters who tomorrow will be leading hundreds of thousands. All right, so this was in fall of 1905. And so, the Bolsheviks did this. They began, or they increased expropriations, armed robberies to fund the revolution. But things degenerated very quickly, and people at large began to confound the revolutionists with ordinary bandits. I had to bring that particular quote to y'all since we've been using that term, bandits. So by late 1907, Trotsky later wrote that Lenin changed front and came out more resolutely than ever against the tactic of appropriations. And Zinoviev later noted that quote, Comrade Lenin's main idea was that we had to remain with the working class and be a mass party, and not to coop ourselves up exclusively in the underground and turn into a narrow circle. We have to use every legal opportunity so as not to divorce ourselves from the masses. All right, coming around the bend here. we cannot, so adjacent to the kind of romanticizing of illegality is the romanticizing the dangers of activism. And there are real dangers, and we should work to avoid them. But like the fear, we can't allow the fears of surveillance, infiltration, and repression by the state and the far right to undermine our ability to communicate and organize. What we do to avoid such dangers, like limiting public communication, maximizing secrecy, only meeting in private, etc., should be weighed against the costs of isolation and irrelevance. We need open, confident organizations working as openly and invitingly as possible. Our problem is not too many infiltrators, it's not enough activists. This requires careful assessment. We don't want to over or underreact. But to assume more repressive conditions than actually exist is to voluntarily limit ourselves in the same way that repressive forces would seek to. We, with the Denver Communists, have received multiple reports that were under police scrutiny. After New Year's Eve noise demo at the federal prison, after J20, the police inquired about us with multiple comrades that we know that got arrested. They thought that we organized the Queer Wrath March, and they over-policed it because of that. So, no doubt that's true, but what does that mean? Certainly that cops are over-policing our actions and trying to punish people. Are we being surveilled and infiltrated? I don't know. But more importantly, like, how do we respond? Or how are we being surveilled? Are we being surveilled in our homes because we're communists? We're putting this on fucking YouTube. But the important question is how should we respond? And do we go underground? We've chosen, and like Lukács says, ultimately communist organizations need to combine legal and illegal struggle. We've chosen the path of under our current conditions, legal struggle, with the exception of marching in the street, basically. So that sort of changes how we might respond. If we were involved in lots of meaningless illegal activity, we might take a different tack. And I have some examples that I wanted to discuss. I feel like I've gone on too long already, so I think I will leave those for discussion and end there. Thank you, comrades.